Hello and welcome to the Many Rules of Film Club. My name is Jeff Yance. I am the program director at the Loft Cinema, and I'm joined, as always, by my favorite occasional filmmaker, Heather Lades.
Hi, Jeff.
And multimedia artist, Rusty
Boulet-Stephenson.
Gracias.
Gracias.
Oh, no.
No.
Boy, Rusty.
Oh, no.
That's wrong.
Rusty.
I thought I was okay with it, but now I'm not.
No. That's fine.
That's fine.
Okay.
It makes me laugh.
So that will all make sense momentarily as we discuss a really amazing filmmaker who I think is probably one of the greatest auteurs that we have currently working in cinema today, Pedro Almodovar from Spain.
See.
Yep.
Yes. And that's why perhaps Rusty was
Using the Castilian
using the
Spanish.
Castilian dialect.
Being a little lispy.
Because one of the pleasures of watching Almodovar films is listening to that dialect, because you don't hear that much anymore.
Well, and certainly where we live,
Yeah, not in
Not here.
southwestern
Arizona.
you never hear it in the Sonoran Desert or
No,
Sonoran Mexico. It's a very different kind of Spanish that they use for Castilian Spanish. And it was instituted because Franco, dictator of Spain for so long, 40 years or so, 50 years,
Yep.
he insisted on Castilian Spanish. Other forms of Spanish were not allowed at all. And there were actually there were people who were prosecuted by the Franco regime because of their use of different dialects.
Yeah.
And so it became a very stylized
And
very
ingrained in the
recognizable-
culture.
And
Yes.
ingrained in the culture.
Yes. Yep.
And that culture is part of what drives Almodovar.
For
Yes.
sure.
Yeah. And so Almodovar, started making feature films in 1980, but he was making short films in the 70s as a very young filmmaker.
With a Super 8.
Super 8, and also was a punk rock musician and an artist and kind of a live theater performer.
Yeah, avant-garde theater
Yeah.
for the time.
And if you look at some of the things that he was producing back then before he became a feature filmmaker, it was really wild and kind of off the wall and just really flamboyant and crazy and edgy and angry because they were responding, he and his friends, to Franco and the post-Franco
The
liberation.
repression that went on under
Yes.
Franco. Women were not given any voice.
Right.
It was male dominated. It was there was a real attempt to get rid of diversity in Spain.
Yes.
And that was the insistence on Castilian Spanish and
Repressed sexuality.
repressed sexuality,
Yes.
a big emphasis on kind of the machismo and bullfighting and flamenco, where other art forms were not allowed and repressed.
Right. So Almodovar just really sort of reacted against all of that and just made this very kind of open cinema where anything went and anything was possible. One thing I love about Almodovar is that he is so kind of open-hearted and accepting of every kind of gender, sexuality, viewpoint, drug use. There's a lot of drug use in his early films, and everything is treated as okay because it's just an expression of personal freedom.
That's right.
And it's presenting in a non-judgmental way, too.
Right.
It's just saying, here are these characters, and I'm going to show you a variety of them, and I'm going to, for the most part, not pass judgment. If there is judgment, it's through the other characters and the storytelling. But as a director, he's not presenting you them
Right.
in a judgmental way. It's refreshing if you really look at it.
Well, and very refreshing when you compare his cinema to Hollywood cinema, which can be very judgmental
Yeah.
and very ideology-driven, a specific agenda. I feel like Almodovar's agenda still to this day is just to live and let live.
There's so much truth to that, I think.
Yeah.
In all of his films, there's in his early stuff, I guess there's some. It's kind of used for comedy. Some of it, as we kind of discussed, Labyrinth of Passion has a grandma who's a heroin addict, and that's kind of used for comedy.
Yes.
But it's not judging it. It's just used as this is so different, I guess, right?
Right.
And so, yeah, you can be transsexual, transgender in Pedro Almodovar's world way before it was accepted in America.
Yeah, he was doing it in the early 80s, having transgender characters in his films with no judgment passed on them. And he was really, in that 80s period, doing a lot of shock value kind of filmmaking, which is why he's been compared a lot to John Waters, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right.
But out of I think he was doing it out of political reasons and also personal, but the political is personal when you're living under a Franco
Right.
regime, a dictatorship. So if you some of those early films, Dark Habits, about the crazy nuns who were drug addicts and lesbians and doing lots of wild stuff in the convent, Labyrinth of Passion, the punk rock movie, Matador.
Really dark film.
Yeah, really dark film. One of my favorites is Law of Desire with Antonio Banderas, which was from the 80s, which is about a gay couple and a transgender woman and kind of how they navigate Madrid. And really great. But one of my favorite movies that I want to talk about, I think, is the film that is considered the transitional film for Almodovar from his early kind of shock value, like really wacky films in the 80s into his more mature dramas, the prestige films that he's known for today. And that's Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown, which came out in 1988. This is the movie to me that when I think of Almodovar, I conjure up images from this film.
Yeah, it was my first
Yeah,
Almodovar.
I think for a lot of people it was the first. It was the film that broke him through internationally outside of Spain. It was his first Oscar nominee for Best Foreign Language Film. And I think a lot of people discovered him through this movie. It's still kind of wild and crazy and zany, but it's also an emotional drama. And there's there are a few shock value moments, but it's really toned down in that sense. But it really established the aesthetic of the bright pop art colors and the really overheated emotions and the really wacky subplots that all sort of diverge and converge together, and kind of a sprawling cast of women, all on the verge of a nervous breakdown. So
Rightly so.
rightly so, exactly. So this movie stars Carmen Maura, who is one of his go-to actresses, who's been in, I think, 7 of his films. She was in all of his 80s films. Knew him as a young musician and as a theater artist. So she was with him from the very beginning. And she plays Pepa, who is a Spanish TV star whose boyfriend, Ivan, has just dumped her. And so she's kind of losing her mind over a 2-day period where she's trying to figure out where he is because he's dodging her. And the whole film is kind of based on miscommunication via telephone. There's lots of answering machine messages. You can never make this movie today in this way
Yeah.
with cell phone technology. So there's lots of racing around trying to get to answering machines and to phone booths and to telephones. And she can't figure out where he is. He's leaving town with another woman. And as hijinks ensue, this crazy group of characters converges in her apartment. There's another woman who's been having sex with a bunch of Shiite terrorists, and now she's worried that she's going to be arrested by the police for colluding with terrorists. Antonio Banderas pops up in the film, who's also one of Almodovar's go-to actors, as a stuttering young sexually repressed man who's looking to rent her apartment. There's a crazy Ivan's wife who's been in a mental institution for 20 years shows up out of nowhere wearing this crazy array of wigs and like leopard spotted jackets and
eyeliner for days.
eyeliner for days.
I admired that eyeliner.
Yes. She's got guns. She's involved in a motorcycle chase. There's barbiturate spiked gazpacho that people end up drinking. So
Yeah.
there's all these unconscious people in her apartment by the end of the movie. There's a burning bed, people falling over the ledge of her apartment, penthouse. It gets really crazy and it gets really ramped up. And it's clear that he was influenced, and he has said this, by 30 screwball comedies like the Preston Sturges films, where you
Definitely.
have everyone talking really fast and lots of misunderstandings and no one just slows down to ask what's going on
Right.
here. Because if
Let's
they
get
did,
this clear, because if they did,
there would be no film,
Yeah.
of course. So it is really wacky, and there's a lot of, I would say, like campy elements to it. But at the core, it's a real emotional story of Peppa, played by Carmen Maura, who's looking to be an independent woman. She decides by the end of the film that she doesn't need this guy, which is the best decision she makes in the film. And it ends with this community of women being created in the apartment. She goes back to her apartment, and the women are still there, and they all sort of comfort each other. And I just love this movie. I laugh. I get a little emotional. I think it's visually just stunning. His aesthetic, the pop art 60s aesthetic, the houses, the colors, really just great. And I think it really plays up to me how great Almodovar is with women in films.
Yes.
Probably one of our greatest. They used to call them in the 40s in Hollywood women's filmmakers. And it was typically men like George Cukor and Vincent Minnelli making movies starring Bette Davis and Joan Crawford. Not together, because when you put them together in a film, that's when it got into horror territory. But in the 40s, these melodramas were a big thing in Hollywood, and I think that really has influenced Almodovar's love of female characters. And he's often said that women make the best protagonist in films because women have access to a wider range of emotions than men do. And I would agree with that.
Yeah.
Even as a man, I would say yes. I think women are much more emotional, have a wider range.
Sure. Well, I mean, men have been told to repress a lot of emotion for
Right.
decades in America.
Right.
When if
It's changing now, but
an American director directed that story, it would have not have been as filled with humility and
Yep.
looking at the women. He could have made the women to be hysterical. I mean, the title leads you to believe, like,
Yes.
maybe is he leading that to be hysterical and nonsensical, and why are these women? But really, in the story, they have very good reasons to be upset. And a lot of it has to do with the men not communicating with them.
Exactly.
And then they use the technology with the phone and the answering machine, of course, as a way to show that. But I think Pedro has like that sense of women and how there can be a family without being family, and how they relate to one another. And I think he can do that in a comedic way, like he did. But it's respectful.
yeah.
Yeah, and we often hear about the Bechdel test today about women in film and how much of their dialogue is not related to men.
Right.
I don't think that the Almodovar films necessarily pass that test because quite often these women are reacting to men in their lives, but
For sure.
they then come to the understanding that they don't need men often,
Often, yeah.
which I think is great.
Yeah.
And clearly Pedro Almodovar loves women. You can feel a real affection. I know he was very close to his mother. And it really comes through in the films. It never feels like he's making fun of them, even though they're put into some pretty outrageous situations and costumes and
Right. Well, I think
emotions.
he also puts a face to something like the older wife or ex-wife of Ivan, the Pepa's boyfriend.
Yeah.
She's putting a human face on a woman who obviously had psychological issues, and making it not seem so unreasonable for her to be having these responses, for being angry, for being stuck in this mental institution. So it's all chaotic, but he puts a face to it, and it's not disrespectful.
And that face just happens to have a lot of crazy eye makeup and wigs.
Right.
And
It's
she's
hard
used
to
as,
explain, but
yeah, and she's used as a cautionary tale for the
Right.
other women. Like, this is what loving this man is going to
Right.
do to you. It's going
Right.
to drive you literally insane.
Same, yeah.
So it ends in this kind of crazy confrontation at the airport where the ex-wife is running around with guns trying to shoot Yvonne who's getting on a plane to Sweden.
And that he's not worth it. I mean, in the end, it's like,
He's
who is
not
this
worth it.
man? He's
Yeah.
affected all of these women's lives, and he continues to with a new woman, and he's just not worth all of this trouble that they're going through.
Correct. Yes. Yeah, and I just wanted to give a shout out. There's an actress who pops up in a lot of Almodovar films named Rosie De Palma.
Love her.
I love Rosie De Palma, and you don't really see her in a lot of other films besides Almodovar films, but she has this amazing, and I'm sure this is why Almodovar was drawn to her, this amazing face
Yes.
and a
Yeah.
real kind of distinct personality that you don't often see in films. They're really tough, and she's just great. She became a famous model for a while in the 80s after starring in the Almodovar films.
Oh, wow.
Which I think is great because she's kind of an unusual looking woman.
I love her nose.
She has this great nose.
I mean, honestly, like, it's
Yes.
like an architectural monument.
She has what I like to call a Picasso face.
Yes.
Where the features are not symmetrical, but it works and it looks like a piece
She's
of art.
great. I love her.
She's great. So after Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown kind of made his name in America and other countries, he sort of took a little bit of a turn towards more mature filmmaking, I would say, with Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down, which was his next film, which, I think is a great film, but it's a troubling film.
Yeah. It's troubling. It's the one I watched. And just to note with Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown, Agustin Almodovar said that they gave them the credibility to be able to make Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down fully financed, when before all of their movies were maybe 70%, 80% financed when they started shooting, and they had to find the rest along the way.
Because Miramax took over Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down.
So
it was an actual big studio film.
Yeah, so it was that appeal and the comedicness of it, I think, is what created that mass appeal. So it's like, oh, he can bring an audience in, so we'll give him the full financing. So I think it's interesting that he then goes to Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down, which ends up getting an X-rated MPAA rating.
Yes.
But anyways, Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down is somewhat troublesome, and as in these days one would call it problematic. However, worth watching. It's about an actress. Well, actually, it starts off with Ricky, who's played by Antonio Banderas, who all I have to say about that is don't base your vision of him on solely U.S. movies. Please watch him in his Spanish movies.
He's great in the Almodovar films.
He's great, and he's great in his native language.
Yep.
I think people have just, the U.S. did a disservice to this man. He's a great actor, especially in Almodovar movies. So he is leaving. He's getting released from an institution. He was foster kid, but also later as a young adult placed in this mental institution, and you see him being released. He's the handyman of the institution, but he's also a patient, and the director releases him, and it's obvious that he's a young guy, but also has his way with women because he's romanced the director, and she's very sad and teary and gives him some money and says, here, go make your way in the world and never come back. So here he is, and he's in love with Marina, who is an actress who is making her way into regular movies when she originally started off as a porn actress. And he's in love with her. He knows where she's shooting her movie. So this is kind of a movie within a movie. So he goes to find her on the set of the movie. And they're making this movie that's ridiculous, like kind of Beauty and the Beast or Phantom of the Opera-esque movie within the movie, where, this woman is being wooed by this man who has this ugly face, and you don't see the whole backstory of the movie, but that's the chunk you see. And it's crazy. It's that part is over the top, very Almodovar, the movie within the movie. But the outside is, so here's Marina, who is making this movie, trying to make the transition from porn star to regular, and it's alluded that she also has a drug problem, and she's been clean. And what ends up happening is Ricky kidnaps her. He finds out where she lives. He goes in her dressing room, steals her keys, etc., etc. And that's the part that's really, like, I would say one of the most brutal parts is when he forces his way into her house.
Yeah.
And he kidnaps her, and there is definitely some physical violence. He punches her. He headbutts her. That was hard to watch. But it evolves into this weird, I guess, Stockholm Syndrome-esque kind of vibe.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's these two troubled people that you find endearing in the end, which is very strange. But along the way, she fights against Ricky the whole time. She doesn't want to, she tries to get away from him. The fact that he hurt her, she's in pain. She ends up kind of getting back into the drugs because asking him to get painkillers for her.
Because he cracks her tooth.
Yeah,
he
cracks her tooth, and her jaw is swollen. And you see her, her face is swollen, and she's in pain, and he does this under the guise of he loves her. And when she asked him what his plan is, what Ricky's plan is after kidnapping her, it's like, oh, we get married and we have kids. And have a few babies, and she's looking at him like he's insane, because he is. But no normal person would kidnap someone assuming that they would willingly then marry them and have children with them and have a life. So the whole thing goes, and Marina's goes missing. Her sister comes to look for her. That kind of a little bit of hijinks vibe there. But along the way, he ends up leaving the house, and every time he ties her up, of course, And she asks, you're going to rape me. And he's like, no, I'm not going to rape you. We will make love when you want to, or something like that. It's a little bit of ridiculousness. So that's where he's coming from. And he leaves the house one point to get her more drugs. He himself gets beat up. And he gets beat up by
Rosie De Palma.
Yes, Rosie De Palma.
On a moped. Yes.
She's great. She plays a drug dealer. It's great in that scene.
Yes.
Well, he at one point stole from her, and then she gets her revenge and beats him up. And so Ricky comes back to the apartment, and so what does Marina do? She sees him in this vulnerable state, bleeding and in pain, and she cleans him up. And that's the moment where you see her. She's no longer feeling like she's so much a hostage as she needs to take care of him. And that's like their evolution of their relationship. That's when they become intimate, and they have, like, honestly, a pretty, I hate to say it, so I'm not sure what it says about me, but a pretty hot sex scene that was like
X rating.
Yes, that got them the X rating. And
Yes.
And the actress who plays Marina is Victoria Abril, and she said that they didn't, they just they did every shot back to back, and that it was pretty intense, and that I can't imagine shooting that scene the way that the shots are great. It's Pedro, so he's gonna have it framed brilliantly. But yeah, it's pretty intense, and that's obviously what got him the X rating. And so then it's like you can kind of see her. She falls for him at that point, but there's still something underneath that's like not quite 100% there. And so things happen. Her sister finally finds her. Ricky's out. Her sister finds her. They escape. And Ricky is left with nothing, basically. He did all of this for nothing. He has nothing. He decides to go home to his hometown that's where he became a foster kid, where his parents died. And in the meantime, Marina's thinking, I fell in love with him. Like, what am I going to do? Like, I fell in love with him. And she has these candy hearts he bought for her. And she ends up going after him, and it's very strange. So Pretty Woman came out 1990, the same year that this came out. And I found it interesting because at the end of Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down, Ricky is on top of like this castle-like building trying to figure out what to do with his life after he has nothing left. And there's Marina driving up in a red car. It climbs the stairs to the castle and basically proclaims her love. I love you. Let's be together. Happy ending. And as soon as I saw that, for some reason, it made me think of the Pretty Woman reverse of Richard Gere climbing up the fire escape
because she's up in the tower.
Because she's up at the tower.
Oh,
and
wow.
it was an interesting comparison for me. I much prefer, even though as problematic as it is,
Problematic.
I much prefer the Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down version than the Pretty Woman version, because she has all the power. Granted, she's making messed up decisions, so don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that she's being healthy here, but she's making the decision. She's in the driver's seat. She literally, in the end of the movie, is in the driver's seat of their car, and it's her sister, her, and Ricky driving, and they're basically talking about him becoming part of their family. Just don't tell mom or dad how.
Yes.
About the kidnapping. And, so it's just a twist on the happy ending, which I don't think, it's very Almodovar. So it's a comparison.
And she's going into this relationship with her eyes wide open. She knows what it is. Whereas Julia Roberts in Pretty Woman, she's totally deluded.
Right.
She thinks
she's buying into it.
She thinks she's a princess. Like,
right. And
prostitute.
I feel and so these two broken people essentially come together to fall in love. Like I said, I'm not saying this is like the ideal in any way, shape, or form, but I completely appreciate the story that Almodovar's telling, because he's just presenting them as people. Two broken people come together, they find love, whether you like it or not, whether you like how it happened.
That's right.
But here they are.
That's the non-judgmental aspect of Almodovar that I love. Is that this is a relationship that you may not want to be in. But it's working for these two characters. And
they both may need years of therapy.
They probably should.
Et cetera, et cetera.
Yes.
But
they're happy
together. But they're happy together. They're going to go live their life. And who knows how the rest of their life may have went. But it was just, I don't know. The first time I saw this movie, I was probably way too young. I was like 14 or something. And I was like, in my mind, like, I knew it was romanticizing bad things. But I didn't appreciate it till I watched it again recently to see that it's not really romanticizing it. It's presenting it for the ugliness that it is, but also saying here are humans that live too, that are gonna love too.
Right.
I watched it in the late 90s with an ex-girlfriend, and she couldn't make it through the whole film. And I could see how that would happen. It might be something that hits close to home for
it
you.
could be triggering for people.
Yep.
For
It
sure.
could be. It could be. And it is problematic. And that was her issue. So even in the late 90s, it was problematic
Yeah.
Yeah.
for an
And
American
Yeah,
audience.
and I think a lot of people these days would still have a problem with it. But I still think it's one of his best, honestly. He gets such great reactions from them. And the other thing is the film within the film, you get some shots of the older director editing the film. And at that moment I realized, Pedro is like one of the directors who appreciates film more than any director I've seen. Like,
Yes.
not just the making of it, but the actual physicalness of the film.
Yes.
You see the film going through the
Going
flatbed.
through the gate. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, the
Yep.
gate. You see, he always inputs, like he has Night of the Living Dead going on the TV. He has the Body Snatchers poster in the editing room. So you get all of these stories, but you also get his underlying appreciation for cinema.
He's movie mad.
You know.
In Women on the Verge, Peppa works as a dubbing artist,
Yeah,
so she
dubbing.
dubs Hollywood movies. In the film, she's dubbing Johnny Guitar, starring Joan Crawford. So it's a reference to the whole melodrama
Right.
genre of the 40s. Yeah, it's just great. You can learn a lot about the history of movies watching
Yeah.
Almodovar
Absolutely.
films.
He's obviously
Yes.
steeped in it.
Yes.
And it speaks to how important Hollywood is outside of America.
Right.
Yep.
Right? I mean, there's so much. Every film of his references 100 other films. Certainly not just John Waters, but Alfred Hitchcock, John Cassavetes comes
Oh,
up
totally.
pretty regularly. There's just a ton. You said Couture.
For sure.
I think that's an obvious reference. And it's so important to recognize for Americans that Hollywood doesn't happen just in a vacuum here, that it
Right.
really is something that other countries look at as an
Right.
important part of culture.
Right.
Right.
And I think that it's also a moment for me, like as a viewer and who has made movies occasionally, that things are going to be problematic. It's not going to be art if it's not problematic, and that you can appreciate them at the same time. And that brings out a discussion. Like, I think that it's awesome that if people watch Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down, and it brings up the discussion of how women are treated, or roles of men and women, and
Right?
and masculinity, like those conversations are not going to happen if art does not happen.
Right. There's value in that.
And there's value in that. So the whole like shaming and outrage of things that people just don't like and don't want to see, I get it, but it's just out of control sometimes, and that we have to remember what art is. So I think that's and it made me really think about that watching this movie.
Well, I think it's very telling that Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down was his first Hollywood studio film, essentially.
That got an X rating.
And they immediately slapped it with an X rating, and that
Right.
was also the year that the NC-17 was instated,
Yeah.
because then it was re-rated when that NC-17 came into being, and it got the
Right.
NC-17, which still
Yeah.
meant they couldn't advertise it in a lot of newspapers,
Right.
and it didn't play in a lot of theaters.
Right.
So I think,
still can't remember how I watched it, but
yeah. So I think maybe that showed him, or at least it showed me as an American moviegoer, that the European sensibility is much broader
right.
than the American cinematic sensibility, because we were restricted from seeing that film simply because a studio had it. It was going into major theaters.
Yeah.
Whereas in Europe, it was no more shocking than the earlier Almodovar films.
Right.
Really.
Agreed. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's right.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I'm so glad that he's had such a long career, though, that he was able to keep going.
Yes. And he found a new muse in Victoria Abril, who was in
Love her.
several of his films.
Yeah.
Carmen Maura, there's a whole backstory that she wanted to play the lead in that film, and he thought she was not of the right age, I will say,
Oh, gotcha.
which caused a huge falling out between them, and so they
Yeah.
didn't work together again for 20 years. She
Wow.
was very offended,
Yeah.
but then she came back for Voltaire, and it was
Yeah.
fine. It was fine.
Yeah.
But he seems almost like Prince, not to bring up another Prince reference, but he finds this female muse. And
That's
they
true.
work together for a certain number of years, and
Yeah.
then they part
Penelope
ways.
did the same,
Penelope
and-
Cruz,
yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, so then at this point, he was basically, I think, one of the most known international artists in the world.
Absolutely.
I mean,
well,
he brought. I mean, for as much as I don't like Antonio Banderas' American roles, he brought him to the U.S. essentially. Like he if it wasn't for
Yes.
him, he wouldn't have gotten any roles here because he was cast as like the hot hunk,
Right.
Latin hunk.
And I think we blame Madonna for that. If you remember in
Oh, God, that's
Truth or Dare,
true.
she talks about how she saw Banderas in an Almodovar film. She said, I want him in American. I want
Damn it,
him to be-"
Madonna.
I know.
But yeah,
She's to blame for a lot of things and
Yes.
to be celebrated for a lot of
Yes.
things.
yeah, both.
Yeah. So, yeah, his career kept cooking, and then I think he hit probably his career high point in terms of recognition with All About My Mother, 1999, which he won the Oscar for.
Yeah, he won Oscar for Best Foreign Language Film, which is a really crazy category and it is a topic for whole other episodes of Film Club.
Yes, right.
How films get nominated for that and which ones do. It's
Right.
really a messed up process for that
Yes.
particular award.
Yes.
yes, it is.
The Oscars are messed up for a lot of reasons, but that one
Correct.
especially so.
Yeah.
But yeah, he did win the Oscar for that, and it's a super important film. Again, 1999, almost like 1977. We've had episodes about those particular years because they're so groundbreaking. And Almodovar releases probably what's his masterpiece, All About My Mother. Manuela is a mother to a teenage son. And he's very literary. He considers himself a would-be writer. She works in an organ transplant center and helps patients come to terms of giving up their loved ones' organs after death. She would talk to them, and she actually does. She works as almost like a counselor, helping people to come to that really quickly because that decision has to be made quickly. Evidently, in Spain, it's not on your driver's license. You have to ask the next of kin and convince them that it's a good idea. So that's her job, and she and her son are really close, and so close, in fact, that even watching it, I've watched it multiple times. It's one of my favorite movies, All About My Mother. It's one of my favorite foreign language films for sure. But the relationship between them is so close that it almost feels a touch uncomfortable, I think, for an American audience.
Yes. Uh-huh.
It's really sweet, and it's because she's raising him alone, and we don't know why she's raising him alone. We only know she fled Madrid to get away from his father, and that she's raised him on his own, and it's his birthday, and he is really there's the question of how did I get here? You know, who is my father? And he really wants to know, obviously. He's a teenager. For his birthday present, they decide to go see A Streetcar Named Desire, a stage presentation of it. So, and the lead actress is a woman whose name is Uma Rojo, and he's a big fan of hers. It really matters to him to go see this performance. And they do, and they wait afterwards in the rain because it's his birthday, and his mom is, okay, we will wait and try to get her autograph. And she comes out, gets into a taxi, and he bangs on the window, Uma, sign my autograph book. And the taxi takes off, or the car takes off, and he chases it in the rain through the street and gets hit by a vehicle and is killed. And we see then, and I'm not giving anything away, this is the beginning of the movie.
Right.
Yeah.
And we see Manuela now have the role reversed where they're asking her, hey, can we use your son's organs, particularly his heart? And so this starts a grieving process for her. For us as an audience, it's a really interesting set of scenes. Again, it references Cassavetes, but this scene, even though there's a death in it, and you guys have watched it recently, I mean, it's not something that you dwell on. It doesn't make you super sad.
No.
The music is almost lilting and moves you along at a quick enough pace that you don't dwell on the death at all. You feel bad for Manuela,
Right.
but you don't dwell on it, and you go with her instead and follow her grieving process.
It's a catalyst for the.
It's a catalyst for the rest of the film, and you definitely don't hang on. You know what happened. It's part of the story, but it's not something you dwell on. She goes to Madrid to find his father. Even though he didn't even know that.
Esteban.
That Esteban was alive. He didn't even know that, and he is a transgender person who is going by the name Lola. So Lola is the father, and so she goes to look for Lola in Madrid, and she goes to a very interesting cul-de-sac where there's
Yes, you can get anything in that cul-de-sac.
Anything you desire.
Yes.
and it's a really interesting moment, and it reminds me very much of Desperate Living of Mortville.
Yes.
A little bit the edges of
It's a
society.
little raunchy. Yeah.
It's on the raunchy side, to be sure. But none of that phases her. She had lived in this life and lived on the fringes of society in Madrid before the birth of her son, and none of it phases her. And as an audience, you understand she's not casting judgment at all. It's not until she's leaving this cul-de-sac and she stops the taxi because she sees a man attacking someone, and it could be a rape, it could be a mugging, you don't quite know, but she stops the taxi and it gets out, and as soon as she does, taxi's out of there.
Yeah.
Like it's not hanging out in this part of Madrid at all, this Mortville. And she whacks the dude who's harassing the other person with her bag that has a rock in it. And I really love that she's just finally she's seen something that outrages her. Yeah. And it's someone being mean to another person. Everybody else is consensually doing whatever they're doing in this cul-de-sac. But there's the one bad thing that's happening, and that morally outrages her. And she's, by whatever means, she's going to get a rock and whack him with it. Right. And I love it. I love that whole scene. Yeah. It's really brilliant. And it shows Manuela as this very independent woman who is going to stand up for what's right. And I love that about this film. It's some of my favorite moments happen right there. So she saves the person that she befriends, or she recognizes as a friend, Agrado, who is also a transgender person. So Agrado is going to help her find Lola. Lola is this missing person. It's almost like the search for Spock for a long time, where you don't see Lola for a long time in the movie. Everybody's got these stories of what Lola's done to them, and none of it's all that good.
She's like Kaiser Soze.
Yeah, she's like Kaiser Soze.
A little bit.
Yeah, less Spock and more more Soze. And so that's what the movie revolves around, is chasing down Lola so that Manuela can say, you had a son, and we've lost him. Along the way, she meets a nun who is pregnant from Lola. And it's just amazing that no judgment cast ever throughout any of this that's happening. That it's that she's a pregnant nun. You know that as an audience member. Manuela never says that, never casts judgment in that way. I love the way that the film, in Almodovar's earlier work, a lot of this is played up for laughs. In this one, it's not. Everybody is given equal presence. And nobody's judged at all. It's not done for comedic effect. It's done without any judgment at all. And it's really brilliant that way, because I think when you look at the past of the history of Spain, there has been so much judgment cast on women, on transgender folks, on minorities in general in Spain. Right. And so this film is really standing kind of up to that, I think. Manuela helps the nun.
There's only one moment where she kind of chastises her.
Yeah.
That she becomes like a mother to her when she finds out about the other.
Yes, she does scold her a little bit.
Yeah, no, she does. And there's a lot that goes on. I really don't want to ruin the movie. I really, and if you haven't seen All About My Mother, you absolutely need to. For a film coming out in 1999, it's so far ahead of where we were in the United States. We weren't talking about transgender issues in 1999.
No.
There were no other mainstream films that had a female protagonist that didn't rely on a male to help move the action forward. Manuela does everything on her own, and it's staunchly independent and fiercely so. It's really amazing, and it's a really wonderful thing. Yeah. And there are a million things I could say about the film, but I love the way it ends with Almodovar. He dedicates the film to all actresses who have played actresses, to all women who act, to men who act and become women, to all the people, a todos personas who want to be mothers, to my mother. And there's a moment, finally towards the end, Esteban's death really starts to ring and resonate with you. And there's a scene with Uma towards the end that just is heartbreaking. She's on stage, and she's now seemingly auditioning for a role that would be something akin to who Manuela is. And it's really wonderful, and it's really heartbreaking, and it really puts into perspective what the loss of that son is for Manuela and for parents who've lost children in general.
Yeah. And just by way of contrast, again, with the European sensibility, and particularly Almodovar's sensibility and the Hollywood sensibility, when you see mothers portrayed in Hollywood films, it's usually a problem. Mm-hmm. They're meddlesome.
Yeah.
The kids don't want to be around them. They're a problematic character. Whereas here, as you said, he's celebrating mothers, and he explicitly states that at the end of the film. And it's just such a different perspective on family and women, and it's great.
And again, that's a theme that runs throughout his, is even though they may not be family members by blood, they share this kinship, and so they will treat each other as family members. Mm-hmm. They're looking out for each other in ways that family would, and it's really sweet. There are a few films that get me the way All About My Mother does.
And I think also a lot of people don't give Almodovar credit for being such a great writer, because the screenplay for this is so complicated in the way that it's got allusions to theatrical presentations and people playing different roles, taking on different identities. There's a lot of referencing of Streetcar Named Desire and of Betty Davis.
All About Eve.
All About Eve is a reference, obviously, in the film and the title. And his next film, Talk to Her, the script is so complicated. That he took months, probably years, trying to plot this out, these films.
Yeah.
Because I think sometimes we think, oh, he's a very kind of wacky, frivolous filmmaker, and he's really not.
No.
He has that in him.
Purposeful. He's very purposeful.
Yeah.
Well, and he had probably made 10 films before he did an adapted screenplay that somebody else wrote.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And, I mean, he wouldn't. Everything's purposeful. It might be complicated, and whether it's a comedy, screwball comedy, or All About My Mother's Story, or one of his recent ones, The Skin I Live In, which is an adapted one as well.
Yes.
It's all purposeful and leads to something or multiple things at the end that make sense.
Right.
So.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Bad Education is another favorite of mine with Gael Garcia Bernal, and that is so there's so many layers upon layers upon layers in that film, and he said he had worked for 10 years on the script. I think he's an amazing workhorse director who is also an artist,
an amazing writer and artist. Yeah. I think too, in addition to referencing all these Hollywood films, he references his own films too. He's got that self-referential nature. The part about the organ transplant counselor is shown briefly in Secret of My Flower of My Secret.
Yep.
That's a very tiny part of that film, and then he picks that up as the beginning of a new film of his. So he's constantly referencing his own work. He's constantly referencing all of these amazing directors in the past and in Hollywood films.
Yeah, and plays. Women on the Verge is based on a Jean Cocteau play from the 30s, which he also referenced in Law of Desire, which was before Women on the Verge.
Yeah.
And then he liked the scene in that film so much he expanded it to a whole film in Women on the Verge.
Only a careful screenwriter can do that. Right? That's not sloppy. That's not just throwing everything out there.
It's paying attention to what you're doing, which is great. And he's made 20 films since 1980, so that's a pretty brisk clip.
Yeah.
Especially when the films are as complicated as they often are.
Well, and something that we noticed in watching All About My Mother again last night, my wife and I watched it again last night and again this morning, a big part of it, was that sometimes the syncing isn't quite right. He kind of hides it a little bit with the music. That's done in a lot of his films, and he's got this quote that's really brilliant, because when you see defects like that in a film, a lot of times you do write it off as sloppy filmmaking. But he says, when a film has only one or two defects, it is considered an imperfect film. While when there is a profusion of technical flaws, it is called style. That's what I said joking around when I was promoting the film, but I believe that was closer to the truth. And I see that in most of his work.
Yes.
He will, especially his early stuff where he didn't have the greatest technical sophistication, he would use that as a way, the same way John Waters did.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you see the huge influence of theater in his early work on how he
Yep.
does shot compositions and how he presents the people
Right.
in the facing the, how they're in relation to the camera, and you see that evolve over time, and it's that kind of a nice thing to actually see evolve if you go through the span of his filmography.
Right.
It is.
Yeah. And now, currently, like recently, he returned to the wacky comedies with I Am So Excited. I don't know if you saw that
Haven't
film
seen
from
I
that.
haven't seen it yet.
a couple years ago, about a plane that's going to crash, and the flight crew tries to entertain the guests
Nice.
while the plane is crashing. And it's just like straight up zany, wacky comedy. There's lots of lip syncing numbers in it. Really fun. And then his most recent film, Julieta, which came out 2016. It's kind of a hearkening back to the All About My Mother sort of heavy kind of drama, emotional, really great. So I think he's now trying to balance both. I think he wants to do the early stuff. He wants to like recapture his youth, but also keep going down this very fruitful path of very strong melodrama and
And strong women roles.
still strong, always strong women.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and keeps his style. He's a filmmaker. You say Almodovar, you immediately know what that looks like
Right.
and what it
for
sounds
sure,
like and what it
yeah.
feels like. And
Without a doubt.
yep,
Without a doubt. One of my favorites.
yes.
I love watching his stuff.
Well, we're gonna keep watching
Yes.
because there's gonna
Sure.
be more to come. So yes, much more Almodovar to come, I believe. So thanks, Heather and Rusty. That was
Thanks,
great.
Jeff.
Geez, it was great.
And that's lots more movies for me to put on my queue. I want to remember all these films a lot because he made so many films. I think it's time to go back and watch a lot of them again.
Yeah, for me, it's been years since I've seen some of them.
Yeah.
I haven't seen Matador in a long time.
Oh yes,
And
so
so
good.
that's
Yes.
one I really want to go back and watch.
So next time on Many Rules of Film Club, we are going to be exploring not a filmmaker, but an archetypal character. So, which leads me to rule number 700 of the Many Rules of Film Club, which is we're all holding out for a hero, but we know that the really fun stuff comes when the villain comes to play. So we're going to be looking at our favorite villains in movies. And I think that's going to be really interesting and fun.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, everybody loves a bad guy or bad lady. So please listen to us. Check us out.
Comment and rate us on iTunes.
Please rate us on iTunes. Please give us your suggestions. Go to our website. Just send
Yeah.
us suggestions.
ManyRulesOfFilmClub.com.
Yes. So thanks once again for listening to the Many Rules of Film Club.